I'm here today in the back courtyard of E-Vam Institute in Carlton, Melbourne, Australia, with Dr. Harry Oldmeadow, prolific author and editor of various books, particularly on the subject matter of the perennialist philosophy, as well as an important study of 20th century Western encounters with Eastern religions, entitled Journeys East. He's also the author of Platform Booksellers and Publications' upcoming release, Timeless Truths and Modern Delusions, Buddhism, the Perennial Philosophy and Modernity. Today he's been kind enough to stop by, and we have the opportunity to see what he has to say about a few things. Thank you for being here, Harry, and welcome back to E-Vam Institute.
Yeah, thank you so much.
So I understand that your interest in Eastern religions and their relationship with the West stems in part from spending time as a child in India. How did you come to grow up there? What was it like? And in what way did it spark your interest in pursuing this area of knowledge?
Well, we were there because my parents were missionaries, they were Methodist missionaries in northern India. We lived most of the time we were there, which was for 9 years, in a town called Azamgarh, which is near Benares, great holy city, not far from Lucknow. So we were there from 50 until 59, so I was aged 2 till 11, so pretty well all of my childhood, apart from the first 2 years, of which I've got no memories at all.
Okay.
It was a wonderful life. It was, as most of India is, it's buzzing with activity. There are all sorts of people, sort of mingling of cultures, Hindus, Sikhs, Parsis, Muslims and Christians. So from a very early age, I was aware of religious pluralism, of these different traditions and cultures, intermingling, different races, different histories. It's hard to say, where things start, but that must have had some impact on me as a child. I was always interested in other religions, as my parents were.
Mm-hmm.
My father in particular had a substantial library of books about Hinduism and Buddhism and so on. So some of that must have seeped in at an early age. But it wasn't actually until I was about 30 that I became seriously interested. So there was a period when I always had fond memories of India and always had an interest in Indian culture and Indian tradition. But it was really the encounter with the perennialist authors that galvanised me, crystallised my interest, and that happened in the 1970s, and we moved on from there.
Mm-hmm. And as an entry point for some people who might not know anything about the perennialist philosophy, like what it's all about, I wonder if you could say something about the diagram which features in the book Timeless Truths.
Mm-hmm.
That might give people a visual representation about
Sure.
What the perennialist philosophy, where they're coming from.
Okay. Look, it's a question that could be answered in a lot of different ways, but let me start here. One of the basic ideas of perennialism is that all of the different religious traditions, for all their manifold differences, in a metaphysical or mystical sense, they all converge, which is to say there's a sort of formless truth at the centre. And to go back to the diagram, it's what we might think of as a wagon wheel. So you think of a wagon wheel, you've got a circumference, you've got the what do you call them, the spokes of the wheel coming in towards the centre. They all converge at the central point. Now, if we imagine the religions as being situated on the rim of the wheel, so some are quite close together, so let's say Christianity and Judaism are kind of next to each other and obviously have a close relationship with each other, one grew out of the other. Or we might put the Chinese tradition or Buddhism on the other side of the wheel. So the outer rim represents the kind of formal religions with their doctrines, their rituals, their mythologies, their scriptures, all sorts of obvious differences between the religions on that kind of outer rim. But within each religion, there is a kind of mystical path, let's say, or an esoteric path, which is concerned about moving towards the centre. Now, as far as most believers are concerned, most adherents, devotees, whatever you want to call them, their religion is all that matters. They're not concerned with other religions. They're not concerned with questions about interreligious relationships or harmony or whatever. They just practice the religion into which they've been born. They carry out certain observances and so on. But there's always a number of people within any tradition who are interested in moving towards that point where the different religions converge. Mm-hmm. Now, we might also say that the outer rim is what the perennialists call the exoteric domain. That is the formal domain, the institutional domain, where all the differences between the religions are very visible and obvious. But what the perennialists want to say is that if we penetrate those forms, not dispense with them, not throw them away, but if we penetrate the forms, if we look into these forms in the most profound kind of way, we will find that while the formal differences remain, there's a kind of core of truths common to all religions, and that it's possible for us to move towards an understanding, not just an intellectual understanding, but a kind of experiential understanding, realisation is probably a better word, of the ways in which these different religions converge. Now, if I could just give another metaphor, that's really the same metaphor as the wheel, but slightly different. It's often used by the perennialists. Is the image of a mountain. Now, when we look at a mountain, if we're standing on the north side, we see a certain aspect of the mountain. If we're on the other side of the mountain, it looks a bit different. If we go around that side, it looks a bit different. And there are many ways of climbing the mountain. There are many paths up the mountain. Some are steeper, some are easier, some are longer, whatever. But if we stay on one of those paths, and we keep climbing, we keep doing our practice, if we're sufficiently diligent and we stick at it for long enough, we get to the top of the mountain. Now, when we get to the top of the mountain, the distance between the different paths on different points of departure at the bottom of the mountain have all arrived at the same point. So that's really the same image, but a topographical one rather than a spatial wheel. Yeah.
Thank you, Harry. And you touched on this briefly just then, but might you want to mention the differences between, say, Aldous Huxley's view of the perennialist philosophy compared to perennialist proper?
Right, yes. Okay, this is a very important point. Can't be accented too heavily. So Huxley put out a book in the 1940s called The Perennial Philosophy, and it was a huge success. It had massive readership, but a lot of people were very excited by this book, and rightly so. It had a lot to offer. What Huxley was arguing was, again, that all the different religions, in their essential teachings, were teaching the same thing. So there's a kind of core of common truths veiled by the formal differences between the religions. But where did he want to go from there? And this is where he diverges from the perennialists. Well, Huxley believed that it was possible to distill these common truths, distill them so that they would be liberated from the religious forms of particular dogmas and rituals and scriptures and all the rest of any particular tradition. We could arrive at a sort of essence that was universal. And in doing so, we could dispense with the traditions. Now, the difference with the Huxley and the perennialists is that the perennialists insist that the religious forms are the gateway, so to speak, to this truth. You can only arrive at this truth, this essence, if you like, by penetrating the forms, going through the forms. So their attitude to all of the, what we might call the paraphernalia, the impedimenta, the accumulations of religious traditions, as far as Huxley was concerned, well, once we understood all this, we could just throw all that in the rubbish bin. The perennials say, no, you can't do that. There's no such thing as a sort of super religion, which is what Huxley was after.
Yeah.
Now, it turned out that what Huxley really meant by a super religion was a kind of California form of Vedanta. That's really what that was really what it boiled down to. Now, of course, the Vedanta does give us a very elevated, and some people would say supreme, kind of expression of metaphysical truths. But nonetheless, from the perennialist point of view, it is only one expression of those truths, and there are many others. Now, to not make this answer too long, but to just go back to the point I was making before. So the moral of the story, so to speak, for the perennialists is that there is no point at which one can abandon one's religious tradition, dispense with it. Short, I suppose, of total enlightenment, but that is so rare that for all intents and purposes it's of no account. Of course, as someone said, well, God has no religion, and I suppose we could say the same about the great sages. But most of us aren't anywhere near that point, so it's dangerous and harmful to think about dispensing with the religious forms. And of course, once we do that, unless we're enlightened, we're at the mercy of our subjective resources, we're at the mercy of the ego and so on. What we need, the perennialists say, is the framework provided by religion. Any integral orthodox tradition will provide us with what's necessary. But it is a great mistake to think that we can somehow synthesize those forms into a kind of super religion, or that we can dispense with them. Swami compared Huxley's agenda with Esperanto. Do you know about Esperanto? It's sort of
the world language.
Yeah, it's a wonderful idea. Let's have a world language. We'll all speak the same language. It's an artificial language that some clever people have made up. Well, Esperanto went down like a lead balloon. I mean, you got absolutely nowhere. And it's the same with ideas about a universal religion. It's sort of got some attraction on the face of it, but really it's not a goer.
Yeah.
Not a goer.
I love that term, spiritual Esperanto. I like that.
Right.
I think it's it's a good way of putting it. I've actually got a question from Laura Dainty here.
Yeah, very good.
She's going back to that, not to bang on too much about the diagram, but the she wanted to ask a question about the indigenous traditions, and you mentioned they might be seen as closer closer to the absolute truth, or visually depicted as closer to the absolute truth in the diagram. One reason she was asking this is because they rely less on traditional forms as opposed to the major world religions.
I wouldn't put it quite like that. I see the point of the question. It's a very good question. But before I answer it directly, just let me make a preliminary observation, which is quite important, I think, for people who might not be familiar with this mode of thinking. I think perhaps we're going to talk about this more a little later, but most of us in the modern West have got a notion of time in our heads which supposes some sort of evolution, that is to say, some sort of growth, some sort of development, some sort of maturation. that things in ways we don't really understand somehow get better, that we understand more and more about the world, science is things people would refer to, modern medicine, all that. To understand the point here, I think we've got to try and put that framework aside. We've got to try and think in a different kind of way. Now, my view is that the primordial traditions, that is to say, the traditions of the indigenous peoples around the world, it's also to say the non-literate traditions. That is to say, cultures without books, without reading and writing. They have a great advantage over what comes later, because this is quite a complicated subject, but I'll try and keep it brief. Language, in a written form, becomes a kind of mediator between ourselves and the world. And in some senses, it erects a kind of barrier. It's kind of alienating. And the primordial traditions don't have this problem because they don't deal in texts. They don't deal in written books and so on. Mm-hmm. So that's one reason. Now, secondly, I think they do have forms. They have forms, they have their rituals, they have their myths, they have their customs, they have all sorts of incredibly complicated laws, rules, taboos, customs. It's a great mistake to think that the primordial peoples are these sort of simple, childish folk who only understand things in a very rudimentary way. That's not the case at all. What we're dealing with here are very rich, very complex cultures. I mean, to just give you a little example, it took the English and Western anthropologists 100 years to work out Aboriginal kinship systems. They were so complicated, they had no idea. It literally took them 100 years of study and of communication with Indigenous folk to begin to get a grip on how these kinship systems work. So, again, we put aside this idea of primordial peoples as being simple-minded and childish. In some ways they were childish, but only in a very positive sense. They did have a certain kind of naivety which the modern cynical mind has lost. So, to get back to Laura's question, I think they have a more immediate and more spontaneous kind of apprehension of reality. Again, this is a difficult kind of question, but if I can just use a little example, I think I used it in one of my talks when I was here at the Institute many years ago. Mm-hmm. Let us take a very sophisticated, very erudite, learned academic from Melbourne University. Let's imagine he's got a string of degrees, he's written lots of books, he's a very clever person, he seems to know everything about everything. Let us put him next to a Aboriginal woman from, let's say, 300 years ago before the Europeans arrived. And let's ask ourselves, well, who's more knowledgeable? Well, the answer is going to depend on what we mean by knowledge. If we mean a kind of encyclopedic accumulation of data, if we mean a sort of mountain of facts, if we mean someone who can tell us about the third law of thermodynamics or the distance between two stars, well, of course, our Melbourne academic is going to be way ahead. But if we ask, well, who understands more deeply what it means to be a human being? Or who understands more deeply what the natural world is all about, what the natural order means and our relationship to it? And then we might pause. We might think, well, the answer isn't so obvious. Perhaps she knows more than he does. I'm personally not quite convinced that she does know more than he does. What she knows is something really worth knowing, whereas what he knows, well, 90% of it is perhaps not that important. Yeah. Yeah, there's a lot of other things that could be said. I'll just make one more point about the primordial traditions. Myth. Swami says in one of his essays that myth is the language appropriate to metaphysics. Now, what does he mean by that? Well, he means that there are certain truths which can't really be articulated in rational, logical, empirical, scientific language. They can only be embodied, not even articulated really. They can only be embodied in stories and images. So that myth is a more, as far as he's concerned, as far as I'm concerned, myth is a more profound mode of understanding than, say, empirical science or rational philosophy or whatever. Now, again, we've got to put aside our normal kind of ideas here because, again, we usually think of knowledge and understanding and philosophy and all of that as evolving and as growing. We might need to try and get our heads around the idea that the obverse might be true. It might be the case that things are declining, they're degenerating, they're flattening out. This, of course, entails a pretty big turnaround in one's mental furniture and one's mental outlook because it's just contrary to what we're normally taught and what we normally assume. So, yeah, interesting question from Laura and a big and complicated subject. But anyway, we've touched on a few possible answers there.
Yeah. And you touched on it there as well, the idea of, well, I guess it's the modern idea of progress and that being wrapped up with our notions of time, as opposed to another understanding of time being cyclical or, in fact, things becoming less truthful, so to speak. Might you want to comment just on how religion and tradition relate to those two notions of time?
Right. Okay. Just to continue on from what we were talking about a minute ago, one of the differences between the primordial traditions and what we might call the historical traditions is tied up with this notion of time. What we've got in the modern West is a very linear view of time. Time starts at point A and moves forward, goes to point Z, and along the way goes through all these points on a kind of line. And we tend to think, not necessarily, but we tend to think of the line as climbing, as going upwards. A whole sort of evolutionary notion. And of course here I'm thinking of evolution not just in the narrow biological sense about mutations and all of that. I'm thinking of it in sort of social and historical terms, social evolutionism. Now the primordial peoples and the traditional peoples largely, not entirely, but largely and for most of history, have had a notion of time which is either cyclical, which is to say time moves in a kind of spiral or a circle, and that things kind of repeat themselves, or in terms of a decline. The Hindu outlook, for example, tends to think of things being at their best at the point of origin, and that as time goes by, whatever it is, let's say a religion, a religious tradition, as time goes by, certain degenerations and corruptions and so on are inevitable. There's a sort of decline, and eventually the thing dies and is reborn, and the cycle starts again. Now, this is a kind of very complicated subject, and we don't want to get into too much detail or argument about it, but you can see that there's a radical difference between a view of history which takes the view that things are progressing, things are getting better, and a view which either is not interested in ideas of progress or which wants to say, well, no, things aren't progressing, they're actually degenerating.
Mm-hmm.
Now that's tends to be the view of traditional peoples. Now this has also got very important ramifications for the way we look at our own religious tradition. So if we take Buddhism, for example, under a traditional outlook, we would want to say, well, things were at their best at the point of origin. Things were at their best at the time of the Buddha. That's when Buddhism is seen in its purest form. Now, as time goes by, it may well be necessary for certain developments to take place. Perhaps I'll use a Christian example, which I may have used before, but it's a good one. People say, well, if what you're saying is true, why didn't the Christian cathedrals appear for 1,000 years? Well, the answer is very simple. The answer is that the early Christians didn't need cathedrals. They were close to the source. They were close to the original teachings. There was still a kind of vibrance about the tradition, which meant that all sorts of other possibilities didn't manifest themselves. By the time of the Middle Ages, it was necessary to kind of revive the faith in various ways and to deal with various issues which had arisen over the last 100 years, various confusions and disputes and so on. And that the cathedrals or the development of scholastic theology, say, with Aquinas, why didn't we have Aquinas in 100 AD? Well, we didn't need Aquinas in 100 AD. We needed him in 1200 AD. That's when we needed him. So this, again, is kind of contrary to the way most people think, because most people want to latch onto what's the latest thing. What's the latest thing? And like in Buddhist circles, for example, one of the latest things over the last 50 years or the last 100 years has been the idea that we will marry Buddhism and modern scientific psychology. That's adding to what we had before. We've got all the stuff from the past, and then we add to that modern psychology, and this gives us new insights and so on. Well, I'm not saying that there may not be some benefits to be derived from the meeting of Buddhism and modern psychology. It's a complicated story, but I also want to say, well, let's be a little bit careful here, because it's very easy for us to, in our kind of infatuation with what is new, what is the latest, what's the most progressive, it's very easy to lose sight of the fundamentals which were there at the beginning. So what perennialists want to say is let's always keep our mind, keep our focus on those elements in the tradition which were revealed at the beginning, which were there at the origin of the tradition, and let us be careful, cautious in any kind of adaptation that we want to make to those teachings and those practices and those institutions. Which is not to say that some certain amount of change isn't necessary or beneficial. Of course, the world around us changes. We're living in a different kind of environment. There are conditions pertaining now which people haven't had to deal with before, and all of this means that we have to come up with responses, we have to come up with adjustments, we have to come up with ways of dealing with new realities. So I'm not recommending a kind of static, unchanging, fossilised kind of tradition which never changes. That's obviously silly.
Yeah.
It's more just a matter of, emphasis and perspective and a kind of sense of proportion. So, for example, with a sense of proportion, let us not situate, the findings of someone like Ken Wilber, say, on the same plane as the teachings of the Buddha. I mean, that just betrays a kind of a lack of any sense of proportion.
If you can say something about the differences that you see between Ken Wilber's integral theory and the perennialist philosophy as it's been presented.
Okay, look, I'm not an expert on Ken Wilber, and as I was just telling you a moment ago, I haven't read anything for the last 10 or 15 years, so I'm not up with what Ken Wilber's writing and saying these days. But the basic problem I have, and it's the basic difference with the perennialists, is that Wilber, like a lot of other people, is really promulgating a form of spiritual evolutionism. Now, this is the fundamental problem. Wilber is obviously hugely erudite, has read a massive amount. He's got a very lively mind, a very creative mind. He's got interesting things to say on all sorts of levels. But informing all of his work is this idea that we are moving towards a kind of higher plane of consciousness. This is actually one of the problems with what we might very loosely gather under the canopy of New Age. This kind of idea that we're evolving spiritually and that we're reaching a new level of consciousness. I mean, this is not restricted to the West by any means. I mean, Vivekananda, the great teacher of Swami of the late 19th century, was very prone to this kind of thing. From the perennialist point of view, all forms of evolutionism are either completely wrong or very suspect. The human being is always everywhere fundamentally the same. A human being, an Aboriginal in the desert 5,000 years ago, his or her spiritual possibilities are not different from our spiritual possibilities, and we're not advanced. We don't have access to some higher level of consciousness. And the idea that the traditional teachings of the great traditions can be improved on or added to is not acceptable from a perennialist point of view. I mean, Vivekananda, for example, says, Jesus and Muhammad and the Buddha, they were great teachers, great teachers for sure. But, he goes on to make a but we now know so much more. Well, really? I mean, as I was saying before, we might know more facts. We might have more empirical knowledge. We have more data at our disposal. And, I'm sure Muhammad or Jesus or the Buddha had no idea how to build a computer. But the idea that their teachings can be added to in any significant kind of way. Now, again, I don't say, these modern theories and discoveries and so on are useless. I don't say that. But again, it's a matter of keeping a sense of proportion. And Wilber also, the other point about Wilber, so spiritual evolutionism is one big problem with Wilber from a perennialist point of view. And the other is that, like Huxley, he seems to be looking for a kind of overarching, it's the equivalent to Stephen Hawking's ludicrous claims to make a theory of everything. Wilber seems, I might be doing him an injustice here, but from what I know of him and the impression I have of him, is he is trying to develop a theory of everything in a kind of spiritual/religious framework. So he's making the same mistake as Huxley made, which is to say he thinks it's possible to draw from here and draw from there and draw from over there and synthesize these into a kind of total theory which covers everything. Now, I just don't think that's possible. If I can just use another image, which might be helpful to some people. We have all these different languages. I speak English and you speak German and this one speaks Urdu. Religions are like languages. We can't speak two languages at once. We might want to learn another language, fine. We might want to, immerse ourselves in another language. Well, we can do that in the religious sense. A Christian can immerse herself in Buddhism, or a Muslim can immerse himself in Aboriginal religion, or whatever. We can learn about these things. We can open ourselves up to them, but we can only speak one language at a time. You try and speak English and French and Urdu all at once, well, what happens? You start talking gobbledygook. Yeah. You're speaking gibberish. What Wilber wanted and what Huxley wanted was precisely, to go back to the other metaphor, a kind of universal language. Well, there is no universal religious language. You speak your own language, you learn it as well as you can, and that language opens up all the possibilities of communication, at least as far as other people who can speak that language are concerned. So they're two serious problems with Wilber. Now, as I say, I don't want to dismiss him. I'm not disparaging his work, holus bolus, but they're the two stumbling blocks as far as the perennialist outlook is concerned.
And going back to the language metaphor, I think you also mentioned in Timeless Truths that even if you become fluent in another language, say you jump ship and go to another religion and completely disregard your religion of origin, or the religion you were grown up in, you mentioned that you still have a special relationship with that religion that you were raised in, because it is so it is the milieu that you were born raised in. So I think that's a good point to bring up, that you do in the book, that you have even with languages, you have a special relationship with your native tongue, so to speak.
Yes, quite.
Maybe that's a good point to jump into the problems facing the Eastern traditions being explored by Westerners and being, for want of a better word, imported into the Western context. Perhaps if you could briefly outline some of what you see are the problems facing Eastern traditions in the modern West. We've touched on the idea of differing notions of time, progress and evolutionary theory being some of the issues.
Okay, well, this is another very big subject. Just to add to that, one of the strengths that I see in, say, Ken Wilber's work is that he's giving some kind of map or some kind of framework or context in which to explore the Eastern traditions. He's sort of at least talking about how it compares and the strengths and weaknesses of different traditions as compared to modern things, which is a forum that I don't see happening anywhere else. So at least there's some kind of discussion taking place in that space. I mean, that's just my view. Well, that's a good point. Look, I think, we've got to take account of the conditions in which we're living. Now, what are those conditions? Well, the most obvious change from traditional times, which vary, how far back we need to go varies on where we're talking about, but the most kind of obvious and radical change as far as the situation of religion is concerned in the modern world is the fact that we are now living in a kind of pluralistic, heterogeneous world where the religious traditions have all collided with each other. Now, in times past, let's say in Tibet, 200 years ago, your average Tibetan person wasn't aware probably wasn't aware of other religions and other traditions. It's not a matter of any concern to them. Religion was Tibetan Buddhism, and that's what one did. Now, of course, all of that's changed. Modern communications and transport, all the rest of it, means that we're now all kind of swirling around together. I mean, Australia's a very good example. Here we are in Australia. We've of course got the original inhabitants, and then we've got the colonisers, and then we've got waves of migration coming from all different parts of the world. So we've now got this very multicultural situation where we've got people of all sorts of backgrounds and ethnicities and religious beliefs. So what we need, I think, is for all religious adherents, no matter what their tradition is, and no matter whether they're adhering to the religion into which they were born, or whether they have taken up a new tradition for one reason or another. What we need is an understanding of the complementary nature of the different traditions, and we need a kind of a respectful kind of attitude to other religious traditions, and an understanding that the religious outlook is everywhere in certain respects, is everywhere the same, and its antithesis is not another religion of a different sort from one's own. The real antithesis is modernity, is this kind of conglomerate of ideas which have taken over the modern Western mind. Now, of course, I'm not talking about this or that individual, I'm just talking about the prevailing trend. So what we've got in the modern West, by and large, is a very materialistic, humanistic, progressivist, scientific, historicist kind of mentality, which is really quite at odds with the teachings of the great religious traditions. So I think people who are still cleaving to one religious tradition or another need to find a kind of common ground with people of other religious faiths in this kind of context. Now, I haven't quite answered your question, which is about the difficulties of transplanting, so to speak, Eastern traditions into the West. Well, there are a lot of problems that just arise out of the cultural differences. So if we go back to Buddhism in Tibet, I mean, what are we looking at? We're looking at a semi-feudal culture where large numbers of people are still semi-nomadic. We're looking at a religious tradition which is centred on monasteries. We're looking at a tradition which is very hierarchical, which is very male-dominated, where political and economic and spiritual power are all more or less interwoven. Compare that with the situation in which Buddhism in the West finds itself. Well, it's, egalitarian, democratic, secular, materialistic, different in just about every way from the environment in Tibet. So how is that, monastic tradition, how is that to find a way of adjusting to this new environment, and how much accommodation should it make? How much adjustment, how much compromise even is necessary in this new kind of situation? I mean, just to take one kind of obvious issue is the question of gender. So, no question at all that traditional Tibetan Buddhism was, as I say, hierarchical and masculine. Now, lay Buddhists in the West, this is not congenial, this is not palatable. So, how do we go about making the necessary changes and what changes are legitimate and what changes aren't legitimate. I don't pretend to know the answers to these questions. They're difficult questions for people to work out. There's a whole raft of questions. I mean, let's just take one more, the question of authority. So in Tibet in traditional times, it's all perfectly clear. There are sort of lineages that come down through time. That authority passes from the guru to the pupil, and one goes through certain initiations. There's a whole lot of stuff about, tulkus and rinpoches and all the rest of it. Can we maintain all of that in a kind of Western environment? Is that still viable in a Western environment? They're difficult kind of questions. Does the authority of the teacher derive from the fact that he or she has been initiated by someone, or does it derive from the fact that the community recognises this person as spiritually mature and qualified and equipped to teach them? Again, another kind of tricky question. So there are many of these sorts of questions that need to be sorted out.
I have another question from Laura.
Yep.
It has to do with modernity as well. The question of modern medicine.
Yep.
I mean, some people listening to this might think, modernity is not all bad.
Yeah.
For one thing, and that many, for lack of a better word, there has been progress.
Yes.
In terms of the physical suffering of human beings and all of that, gender developments and the like, similar things like that. Yep. So her question is in that context. She's asking about modern medicine and the prolonging of human life.
Yeah.
Often people say this is like we have modern medicine, we can live longer, and her question has to do with keeping the elderly alive on medicines for years, or keeping children with chronic conditions alive with all sorts of technology that's been developed. From a perennialist point of view, is that a good idea, basically?
Yes.
Or does it contribute to, prolonging the suffering of human beings?
Yeah.
Because that wasn't in existence 400, 500 years ago.
Okay, look, there are several issues you've raised there. First of all, let me say that I don't take the view, nor do perennialists as a whole take the view that everything about modernity is bad. Things change, some things improve, some things degenerate. And if we look at modernity as a whole, whatever else we might want to say about it, it has undoubtedly had some benefits. But these benefits and modern medicine's not a bad example, these benefits are, in a sense, compensations. That is to say, if we look at the whole picture, if we take everything into account, the good and the bad, modernity must be seen as a degeneration. And that if we're faced with a stark choice between tradition and modernity, it is tradition we must choose, because in tradition lies the greater good. Now, of course, in tradition there is good and evil. No one is pretending that the traditional society, whether it's Tibet or Australian Aborigines or wherever, no one's pretending that those societies were perfect. There were abuses, there were scandals, there were corruptions, there are terrible things that happened. Doesn't matter where we turn. This, despite the promises of the Enlightenment and the utopian visions of all sorts of progressive thinkers in the 19th and 20th century, the fact of the matter is that human nature being what it is, we are never going to have a perfect society. We have never We've never had one, and we never will have one. The question is, how do we make the best of what we've got? Now, compensation. So what we have in modernity is various apparent improvements. Now, sometimes these are real improvements. You know, let's take something like the abolition of slavery. Well, I don't think anyone wants to argue that slavery was a good thing and that it's a pity it's disappeared and that we should bring it back and have more of it. We're glad slavery's gone. That's a kind of evil. That's a kind of abuse of human dignity, which we don't want to countenance in any shape or form. Then we might say, well, you know, the kind of slavery we're talking about in, say, the 18th century, yes, that's gone. But perhaps it's been replaced by other forms of slavery which are just as bad and maybe even worse. So, like if we consider the conditions of living and working that people in many parts of the world, particularly in what's called the underdeveloped world, which I prefer to call the overexploited world, they're living effectively in slavery. You know, they're living on the poverty line, they're working 10, 12, 14 hours a day, they've got very few choices. They're effectively slaves too. So that's one point. The second point is that what looks like an improvement in the first instance may turn out in the long run to be at best rather ambiguous and at worst something quite bad. So let us take the example of, it's a fairly crude example, but I think it'll illustrate the point. I mean, after the Second World War, all around the world, people went berserk with chemical fertilisers. Oh, this is the answer. We grow new crops and, you know, grow much more food. Everyone will be much better off. So, you know, we go spreading DDT and all sorts of other chemicals all around the place. Well, what do we discover? After a little while, we discover, well, the immediate effects look pretty good. Yes, the crops grow quicker, we get rid of various pests, but 15, 20, 30 years down the track, we discover the soil's contaminated, the water's contaminated, it's leading to this problem, that problem, and so on. So a lot of the apparent advances of modern technology, modern science, modern medicine, they're more complicated than they appear, and in the long run, it may turn out to be not a very good thing. Now, finally, to get to the specifics of Laura's question, because the modern mind is so materialistic and so humanistic, which is to say, value is placed on this life in this material realm, on the human individual as a kind of biological organism. So, yes, we want everyone to live longer. Well, if it were that simple, if it were just a case of living longer or not living longer, well, most of us would probably prefer to live longer. Fair enough. But the question is, at what cost? Now, I think with modern medicine and the prolongation of life and so on, we have to ask ourselves the question, well, what is life for? What kind of lives are we living? Why are we here? And what are we making of life? Now, if it's just a question of keeping somebody alive, and that's the be-all and end-all, and there's nothing else to be taken into account, well, I suppose we have to say, yes, longevity is a good thing. But perhaps this longevity, this resort to all sorts of artificial means of keeping ourselves alive and living longer and so on, perhaps that is tied up with a certain impoverishment in our lives. And what really matters in the end is, from a perennialist or a spiritual or religious point of view, what really matters in the end is what we make of our lives in the here and now, and what we think being a human being is all about. Now, is it about just being a biological organism and sort of feeding the senses and accumulating material possessions and getting wealth and power and status and all of that? if that's not what life is essentially about, well then all these other questions start arising. Now, I know this is a very long answer. I've just got one more thing to say. I myself have very grave doubts about a lot of modern medicine being used simply to prolong life. Obviously, it takes a certain amount of courage on the part of an individual to say at some particular point, you know, if I consider my own situation and the doctor says to me, look, you're going to die in the next 3 months unless we do this, this and this. It would take a lot of courage to say, well, that's okay, I'm ready to die. I've had my time. I don't want you to fill me up with these drugs or hook me up to these machines or give me these chemicals or whatever. But perhaps that's what we need to be doing. Perhaps that's what we need to be thinking about it now. I'm not saying I want to make decisions for other people. And it's a difficult kind of predicament to find oneself in. All I'm saying is that I think we need to think about, you know, why we make decisions about these things and what the implications might be of going in this direction or that direction. I mean, the whole business of cryogenics, you know, about people keeping themselves frozen, getting brought back to. I mean, this is all bizarre. This is
Walt Disney.
Yeah, this is a kind of symptom of people who have got no idea of what human life is really all about. If they imagine that they can be frozen in some, you know, machine for 100 years or something until some new medicine is discovered, and then they'll come back and take the medicine to cure whatever disease they've got. I mean, this seems to me to be not only bizarre and ridiculous, but inhuman. I mean, we're born, we live, we die, you know, that's how it goes. We can't live forever, and to want to live forever, even to want to live for a long time, it strikes me as something not quite right about it.
Yeah.
Not quite right about all of that.
Sure. Finally, would you like to comment on, because we're on the topic of modern medicine, and that sort of relates to science in a way. Science is sort of, today in the modern West, it's seen as a good.
Yeah.
Like it's a good thing to be scientific.
Yes.
Might you want to comment briefly on how science can be co-opted by things like capitalism and vested interests, and how it's sort of ethically neutral in a way?
Yes. Yeah, okay. Look, this is very unusual. I've been talking here with you for about an hour and I have not yet unleashed a tirade about modern science. This is almost unprecedented, but I'll try and keep this brief. First, let me make it clear. This often causes a lot of confusion. Let me make it clear that I am not against science. But what is science? Science is an inquiry into the material world. It is a kind of inquiry which at least attempts to be objective, which has certain protocols and procedures to do with, you know, gathering data and experimentation and forming hypotheses, testing them, and verifying them, and coming up with explanations. Now, that's all well and good, and it has its place. We've always had science of some sort, and what we've got now is obviously a very sophisticated and very powerful science. The problem arises when science becomes scientism. That is to say, when science becomes an ideology or a philosophy. Now, what we've got in the modern world is two things. We've got scientific procedure, scientific investigation. That's one thing. We've also got a kind of philosophy, or perhaps more precisely, an ideology, which is derived from scientific inquiry. So that ideology or that philosophy is based on certain premises which are not self-evidently true. but which seem to be taken by many people as being self-evidently truth. So let us take a very simple proposition. Okay, so what we've got here is an ideology or a philosophy. Oh, that's right. So let's take one premise. One premise of the scientific mentality, science is an ideology, is that reality is material. That the material world exhausts reality, and that anything which is not of a material nature, like, let us say, an idea or a dream or something of that sort, anything that's not of a material nature itself is a kind of epiphenomenon, something that arises out of this material substrate. Now, this is absolutely contrary to traditional views of things. The scientific outlook takes it for granted that the most real thing is the most physical, the most material. The traditional view is that the material world is problematic, that it's only got a kind of fugitive reality, it's only got a relative reality. If you look at the teachings of the Upanishads, for example, written 2,500 years ago. So science as an inquiry is fine, but science as an ideology is highly problematical. And it's tied up with all sorts of values. So one of the sort of simplistic notions that people have is that science is admirable and authoritative because it is value-free. Well, it's nonsense. The way it actually works is not value-free. And it presents itself as a kind of objective, value-free inquiry. But of course, as you were saying, as you were intimating in your question, science doesn't exist in a kind of free-floating vacuum. Science is enmeshed in the real world. And if we start to ask ourselves questions about, well, what is science actually being used for? Well, the advocates of science will rush in and say, well, we're developing modern medicines. Look at this, we've got a vaccine for the virus. We couldn't have had that without science. True. Okay. But that's not the whole story. Something like 50% of the world's scientists work on military research. Or military-related research. So what is science being actually used for? It's being used to develop weapons. It's being used to devise new ways of killing people more efficiently. A huge number of scientists work for, multinational corporations. Well, what's the end result of all of that? Well, what's it all about? Well, it's all about making profits for shareholders. Science is implicated in all sorts of, at best, dubious activities, which, if we could see them clearly, we wouldn't approve of, and we'd be saying, well, hold on, there's something wrong here. So, again, it's a matter of kind of, situating things in the right context and on the right level. And as I say, I'm not against science as such, as long as it is seen as a servant. And like all servants, it must have a master. Part of the problem in the modern world is that science has got no master. Science is its own master. So you can justify almost anything in the name of scientific progress. Oh, we'll carry out these experiments, we'll clone, we'll modify genes, we'll do this and that. And someone says, well, hold on, that all sounds a bit dodgy. No, we're advancing scientific knowledge. Oh, well, that's okay. Here's a grant for $1 million. Carry on. As if any advance in our knowledge of how things work and so on is necessarily good. Now, again, I think that's something that we need to. The answers aren't simple, of course, but that's something we need to really think about. Goethe, the great German writer, back in the 18th century, was one of his friends got very excited. He was a scientific kind of a chap. And Goethe himself was sort of interested in natural science. But this friend had a microscope, and he wanted Goethe to look in the microscope and see these bacteria and cells. And Goethe said, no, I don't want to look in the microscope. There are certain things I don't want to see. And the Islamic scholars in medieval times used to refer to science of a very materialistic kind, such as was just starting to emerge in the West. Image they used was these people appearing under Mother Nature's skirts. There's something wrong here. There's something almost blasphemous or sacrilegious about treating nature as this kind of object on the laboratory bench, which we can do anything we like with. We can cut it up, dissect it, burn it, look at it through microscopes. The whole sort of reverential attitude to the natural order, science has more or less destroyed that. So this is another kind of problem with the modern scientific.
That sort of sacred outlook.
Yes, the sacred outlook has been destroyed. Yeah. Largely so by modern science, which is so materialistic, quantitative. Gainon wrote his famous book, The Reign of Quantity. Well, that's largely the story of modern science. It's the reign of quantity turning its back on the reign of quality. Quality has got no place in modern science. Just let me finish on this point. Plato said, what is philosophy all about? Philosophy is about, he gave a lot of answers to this. He famously said philosophy begins in wonder, kind of central thought. But anyway, elsewhere he says philosophy is largely about the discovery of truth, beauty, and goodness. Now, ask ourselves the question, what does modern science have to tell us about truth, beauty, or goodness? Well, beauty and goodness are easy. It's got nothing to tell us. It's got nothing whatsoever to tell us about beauty and goodness. You can conduct any manner of experiment. You can do any amount of research, accumulate mountains of data. It won't help you one bit to understand what beauty and truth are. Beauty and goodness. Truth's a little bit more complicated because scientists would say, we're revealing new truths. No, they're not. They're not revealing what Plato calls truth, which is an understanding of the kind of totality. What they're doing is just offering us more and more fragments, more and more tiny bits. And just as you can't build a building by just throwing things in a pile, just picking bits up and throwing them, thinking they're going to turn into a building, you can't build understanding, you can't build wisdom, you can't arrive at the truth simply by accumulating more and more data. So in all of these respects, science is a limited instrument. It's got its place, but it should be answerable to a higher authority. And I think that authority needs to be religious. Now, of course, that doesn't happen in the modern world, and when everyone suggests that that's the way to go, one opens oneself to all sorts of ridicule. But that's seriously what I think. It needs to be conducted in the framework of an understanding of totality and in the framework of a certain set of values. Because science, I said before that it's not value-free, but the kind of values it attaches itself to are not the kind of values I'm talking about here. It's attached to progress and profit and power and all of those things, not to truth, beauty and goodness, because, as I say, it hasn't really got very much to tell us about truth, beauty and goodness. So we'd be much better off with a science that recognised its limits, that showed a bit of humility, that paid some sort of obedience to higher values, let's put it that way. It's a vague term, but I think you know what I mean. So all of the propaganda about modern science and about science in the modern world is to be treated with a great deal of caution and taken with not just a grain of salt, but a whole spoonful of salt. You can put that into the mix. Yeah. Okay.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Harry Oldmeadow, for taking the time to chat with us here today. And stay tuned for the release of Timeless Truths and Modern Delusions.